Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, as one talks about immigration today, it is not unusual to talk about it in the context of criminal activity. While historically that has not been the case, nonetheless, a new concept called crimmigration, where the criminal justice system has seemingly merged with the immigration system, has become a central feature of immigration policy. And this has led to a marked increase of deportations, especially of those of Latin background. Why is crimmigration gaining support around the country and the world? Next. Joining me today is Felicia Arriaga, Assistant Professor at Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Arriaga's recent book, Behind Crimmigration, ICE, Law Enforcement, and Resistance in America, discusses how federal immigration enforcement programs are implemented through local law enforcement in the new immigrant destination many people consider to be North Carolina. Dr. Arriaga, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. Excited to be here.
Let me ask you this. In your book, one of the things that you do point out emphatically is that this new policy, which is not really new, but it's been given a name since I believe 2006, crimmigration, is really focused on racial profiling, particularly of the Latinx community. So, how did you come up with that conclusion for your book?
Sure. So, and like you said, the term itself is sort of this socio-legal term that has, I think, become more popular in academic spheres, but we've also seen it, I think, come into play in different kinds of legal outfits or legal organizations that are trying to do different kinds of defense work for immigrants. And so for the book that I was working on, most of the population, or most of the undocumented population in North Carolina comes from Latin American countries. And so the context there is a little bit specific to North Carolina. I live in New York City now. And so the context is a little bit, works a little differently because of the large number of Black migrants in New York City. But in North Carolina, what I was finding is that it was being used, this particular sort of program was allowing local law enforcement officers to really target Latino immigrants or Latinx immigrants throughout various communities. North Carolina also, as you mentioned, is sort of seen as a new destination immigrant community, meaning that we've had newer streams of immigrants coming. And so what that means is that communities, particularly government officials, local law enforcement, were really trying to understand what this community looked like, how they acted. And so one of the responses is that you have sort of full-scale community boards, community or government appointed committees that are then put in charge of really trying to understand how to deal with this population. And I think in some instances, that didn't necessarily come with a sort of welcome mat. Unfortunately, it came with we're scared of these people for whatever reason, mostly preconceptions about this community. And so for many, the law enforcement agents were really being sort of supported by community members who were eager to criminalize immigrants in those contexts. So in many places across North Carolina, there are large percentages of Latinx immigrants. And for some of those communities, it's actually driving some of the only growth in those communities. And so I think it was a mixed bag of looking at a few different counties throughout the state and really trying to understand what was being initially explicitly talked about. So I sort of have this conversation in the book about the sort of move to being implicit about some of these policies. But I find that specifically between 2006 and 2008, that a lot of the local government bodies who are ushering in these types of local partnerships with ICE or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that they really were pretty explicit that they wanted to try to deport Latinx immigrants. And so I often sort of think about that the beginning hasn't been reckoned with entirely. And so part of the book is really trying to understand in the sort of 10-year span that I look at, how have communities come back to those same bodies and try to create opportunities for repair. And in some instances, trying to get rid of that program that very explicitly was meant to deport Latino immigrants in the first place.
This could not have come about without the implementation of a narrative. And particularly
Mhm.
when we try to create synergy between criminality and immigration. But the studies don't bear that out. I mean, studies continuously show that even within the undocumented community, crime is not an issue per se, and many studies have shown that. So, how are they able to make this narrative stick when study after study shows that it is simply not accurate? How does that happen?
Yeah, and I think that that is the crux of the issue, right? That I think what I saw happening in the counties, in the 5 counties that I was looking at, is that the narrative from ICE officials and from local law enforcement is they would choose a sensationalized case, meaning a case where there was an undocumented person who maybe did commit multiple crimes, and really use that to drive home the point that they needed the program, they needed this partnership at the local level. And so it often had really nothing to do with the sort of general information that was in itself hard to get, right? So I think that that's part of the issue too, and in some of the studies that try to merge the criminal justice information, the data on the criminal charges, with some of the immigration databases. It is quite actually challenging to sort of even look at what is the general information about these populations. And so often when I would go to these what are called steering committee meetings, and ICE is presenting the data about the number of people who are being deported out of each of those counties in North Carolina, you would see that there was still a certain number of people who are being deported without criminal records, right? And so I think that they're overarching, they would just go to that one story. And I think in the case, it doesn't just didn't make it in the book, but in the years since I did some of my research, um, particularly in Henderson County, which is where I grew up in Western North Carolina, ICE took this approach of actually putting up billboards on the one of the main highways, which specifically was meant to draw attention to individuals who had ICE, who were wanted by ICE, right? And so again, to really sort of drive home the point that this program is needed, and I think often the data doesn't back it up. I think at the national level, I was just looking at the 2020 immigration statistics. I think we're at 50% of people who are deported have criminal records, right? So there's 50% who don't. And so I think this conversation, this narrative, people want to latch on to it because of all of the things we know historically, is that people need a scapegoat, right? Need to be able to point their finger at somebody to say that we want to do something about this thing, when in reality, in some of the instances in sort of North Carolina, some of the sort of economic concerns are just broader economic concerns. It's not that these individuals are taking their jobs at all, especially because where I grew up, most of the work is agricultural work. And we know from other states in the South in particular that whenever there have been these full out state policies that limit undocumented migrants working in the fields, that the economic sector suffers, right? And so I think that people want to latch on to this story and be able to sort of go with that instead of actually looking at what's actually happening locally in their communities.
So how do you combat that? Because as you just said, in all, your PhD is in sociology. And so you understand that people want to latch on to that which confirms what they believe from an emotional perspective. So, but how do you begin to combat that? And the second part is, I think, as Cesar Garcia Hernandez has pointed out, that this is a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of how we deal with the notion of immigration. This started to happen in the 80s and the 90s, beginning with the Reagan administration, and has continued ever since, um, with Bush, with Clinton, with Obama, notwithstanding the DACA program. But so, how do you combat this problem of the narrative that people have accepted? How do you begin to do that?
Yeah, and I often think about this question too from some of my organizing background too. So for about 10 years, I uh, led and co-led different efforts at the state legislature in North Carolina to push back against some different kinds of bad bills. And so I think that there's the conversation that happens with like politicians, which is a little different than I think some of these one-on-one conversations you have with prominent business leaders potentially in your community. And so I think from that legislative work that I've done in the past, I think the conversation was we always had to switch to we could definitely bring people and tell their stories. And unfortunately, that wasn't convincing anybody, especially in a place like North Carolina where it's Republican majority, right? And so in talking with legislators, especially ones who are Republicans, I think the conversation had to move a little bit more about like, what is the economic impact, right? And so I talk about in the book in a few different places where having the conversation about what this means if we were to completely deport everyone, that would be a negative impact on communities, right? And so particularly in more agricultural sectors, like there's the North Carolina itself really depends on agricultural work, right? And many of those folks who have moved from agricultural sectors have also now moved into some of the other sort of processing chicken plants, hog processing farms. And so like the workforce is needed, right? And so I think the conversation with politicians, with growers, is a little different, right? I think that conversation is about how do you keep a stable workforce, right? That isn't going to be fearful of being deported, isn't going to be is going to come to work, right? Because I think that that's what we've seen too, is that in plenty of instances where there is this fear of being deported, the people aren't necessarily going to go to work. That's one of the things, or going to take their kids to school. And so I think from the economic piece, there were some interesting ways that I think local politicians, at least in the more agricultural places, they very much were willing to have a conversation about what it meant to really think about these kinds of local immigration enforcement partnerships and what it was doing to their workforce. And so I write in the book that some of those folks actually did write to their congressmen to ask them for immigration relief, for widespread immigration relief, right? Because they did want to have a stable workforce. And so I think there's that conversation about sort of how do you talk about the economics of the need for workers in this country. And then on the other side, I think these one-on-one conversations are a little bit harder. I think that that's definitely clear. I grew up in Western North Carolina. It's at the time, I think now it's probably close to 10% Latino population and a majority white population. And so I think having the interpersonal conversation is a little bit different. I think that takes like a lot of work. I think it takes sort of this deep relationship building. And I think we've sort of seen this a lot, particularly in faith communities. I think faith communities are, especially white-led congregations, are sort of stepping up to really be supportive of immigrants in this moment. And I think that that's something that comes from partially the faith component, but I also in the book try to at least problematize this kind of savior mentality too, because I do think that in certain instances, when some of the more sort of enforcement practices that were pretty visible, when they died down a little bit, that some people backed away from organizing around this particular issue. And part of that was because if it was white-led, white people in these congregations who didn't necessarily have a direct connection to immigrants or direct connection to immigration, then it wasn't necessarily impacting them at the time. And so I talk about this complexity when it comes to really keeping consistent pressure on the agencies and why it was that we sort of see what I call like the normalization of this partnership, because there isn't this consistent paying attention to what's going on. So I think the conversations are a little bit different depending on sort of what level you're sort of talking about, because I do think there are plenty of folks who I never expected to write into Congress asking for comprehensive immigration reform because they wanted to have a consistent workforce. And on the other hand, talking to some individuals at the state legislature, it also became like pretty obvious that they were never going to be willing to speak to undocumented people directly either.
Let me ask you this. I want to shift a little bit. If I took it out of the realm of, let's say, the Latinx community or
Mhm.
people of color and the like, what do you say to folks who say, listen, they're trying to get into the country and they're undocumented, they haven't gone through the whole process yet, and they do commit a crime? What is wrong with deporting a person? Should not a person that wants to get into the nation or to the country abide by the nation's laws? So, are you saying that any law that is infracted by an undocumented should not be a reason to deport them? Or do you draw a line somewhere and say, well, here are things that, yes, if they do this kind of crime, they should be deported? Where do you draw the line there?
I don't draw the line. I think for me, I stand pretty firmly that these are two different entities of law, and that an immigration violation, which is typically what we're talking about, which is where a person has crossed the border illegally for whatever reason, that is civil law, right? That has no sort of criminal standing in some ways. It has become, right, a basis for the justification of deporting people once they've finished their criminal sentence or time within the criminal justice system. And so I do draw pretty like strict lines that the criminal justice system, criminal law says one thing and immigration law says one thing. So I do make that distinction. I don't think that anyone should be deported for any crimes. And I also think that like for me, it's because I also study sort of the way we think of crime in the first place, that it's also challenging for me to always come to a consensus with other people about what is the definition of crime itself, right? And so I often there's this chart that I often use when I'm talking about this that is from a training manual from ICE, and it's from back in 2012 training manual. And on that particular sort of diagram, they're showing like all the ways that immigrants might move through the criminal justice system and then out of the criminal justice system, which for them means they could potentially go into ICE custody, depending on sort of what the relationship is between that particular piece of the criminal justice system and their agency. And on like the left-hand side, they just sort of have this big column that just says crime. And so I think like we also, part of the reason I have such strict boundaries around there's immigration law, there's criminal law, is because I think crime itself, I think we don't often interrogate what does that mean in the first place, right? I think people have been criminalized, immigrants have been criminalized across our country's history. And so to understand some of the conditions or what causes people to commit crime, I think is part of the thing that we don't often do, right? And on the other hand, too, to even understand that like crime data is also pretty messy, right? So I think I've taught criminology courses in the past, and one of the things that I do with my students is really start from helping them understand that the crime data that we currently have really varies by state, by locality. There's different requirements around whether or not you have to report to the federal government, to these national databases. And so I think the sort of concept of crime is often sort of not interrogated. And so for me, it does become this sort of strict line of immigration violations should be treated one specific way, and criminal charges should be sort of treated in a different way too. And I think over time, like, we often don't consider like why people come to this country in the first place. And so I think that the sort of deporting them back for potentially engaging in some kind of criminal activity doesn't actually deal with these bigger issues, which are what is our relationship to their country of origin, right? Why is it that they had to come to this country in the first place too?
In the world of politics, North Carolina is a Republican state, and crimmigration is going across the country. In fact, it's international, that the whole
Hmm.
concept. So where is there going to be the compromise when it comes to that? So, for example, crossing the border illegally for whatever reason, let's put that to the side and say that is a civil matter to be
Yes.
handled by the immigration system. But if a person is here, let's say, and they commit a felony, murder, or whatever the case may be, should that not be, because there is precedent for that. If you go back to the early days of the mafia, for example, certain people were deported because they
Hmm.
did commit crimes. So shouldn't there be some sort of compromise that says this is civil, but when we start talking about felony and violent crime, that's a different category. That for whatever reason you came here, that once you engage in that, many people would say that that's a line that's going too far.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't know. I have this, the challenge for me is that people are deported after they've served their criminal sentence. So for me, I always try to take a step back and really try to understand what is the purpose of their incarceration, and what is the purpose of their deportation, right? So I think plenty of legal scholars talk about this as they have served, they have paid the consequence for their criminal charge, right? They've gone through that process because people are not supposed to be deported prior to serving that time, right? And this is a conversation that I had with sheriffs, multiple sheriffs in North Carolina, is that they want them, right? They want them to serve their time in North Carolina. They want them to do that. And so I sort of question, what is the purpose of deportation, right? What is the purpose of deportation? Is it really to banish people? Like, what is the sort of purpose if they've already done that, serving their time for the criminal justice, like in the criminal justice system? Now, do I believe that the criminal justice system is repairing people or sort of like doing those things? I don't necessarily think that either, right? There's plenty of studies that show that people are more traumatized, right, when they come out of the criminal justice system too. So for me, I don't think that people should be deported because of that. And part of it is because I think the system itself, um, I think about it like, if we allow for these exceptions, or if we allow for this to be sort of the rule, then what we could see, right, is this continuous like shifting of the policies, right? So I think that is what we've seen over time. So we sort of have these like priorities of who gets deported. There's different levels, and so when I was doing my research, the levels, there's 3 different levels, and the third level is pretty vague. It just says any other thing that ICE officers decide is necessary for people to be deported, right? And so I think the priorities aren't clear cut. And I think that is the challenge for me to sort of agree with these are people who should be deported, these are people who shouldn't, because I think it is so flexible. And if we don't have a way to like monitor how that is actually happening, then I think we sort of lose the ability to even say when it's being applied and when it's not being applied. On top of, in plenty of other places too, that across the country, it also varies on whether or not the local agency can actually hold you for ICE to pick you up, right? So that's also sort of a different process, which is many people, right, are arguing through lawsuits that it's illegal for that agency to hold you past your criminal charge, right, while ICE decides whether to come pick you up or not. So I think that there's like a bunch of different sort of components that I'm uncertain about how it works, and so that then gives me pause about how do we, if we should apply it on all of these different cases.
If they change the policy, let's say, because if a person has paid their dues, so to speak, to society, that is one thing. And so you technically, theoretically, you should be starting anew. So I think everyone can agree with that. What would happen if they changed it that said if you are undocumented, if you're not a citizen, and you committed a violent crime, rather than serving time, you were deported? Would you support that?
Can you repeat the question one more time? Sorry.
If you were rather than, because if you serve your time, theoretically you start anew. That's the theory. But if they change the policy or the law to suggest that if a person has committed a crime, now of course you have to go through a process of court, trial, and jury. But let's say that person is found guilty, rather than serving time, if the policy says rather than going to jail, we're going to deport, would you support that?
That's a good question. I think I would support it if undocumented immigrants supported it. So I think most of any of the policies that I sort of work on, the state legislative work that I've done in the past, was very much sort of following the lead of undocumented people and their decisions. I definitely would expect that some people would choose that, right, depending on sort of how long the sentence is. I think the concern then becomes too, though, what is our responsibility to deporting potentially criminals to other places, right? I think that that's the other sort of question. And I think the sort of extreme example of that is the sort of creation or like the beginning of like MS-13, right? Which is the sort of one of the bigger gangs that we know started in California, but because of our deportation policies, many of those people were then deported back to their country of origin, and that's the current situation today, right? In some of those countries, and these sort of creation of max prisons in those countries, is partially like our fault, right? It's partially our responsibility because we didn't necessarily have a hold on it when it was being constructed here in the United States, and then our sort of response to that is to deport people, right? So I do think that I think there's sort of pros and cons to both of those sides of things. And I don't necessarily have, but I think that the answer is following the lead of undocumented people and whatever choices they have with representation, right? I think that that's clear, is that all of these the process for immigrants in particular, both in the criminal justice system and even when they're going through immigration proceedings that don't civil proceedings, is that often they're not having representation that can actually help them explain these choices, right? And so one of the things that I've been looking at more so in sort of the New York context is that New York has the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project, and that particular project provides public defender support for immigrants who are in detention, right? And that sort of program is unique for New York, but that's not also consistent across the rest of the country, right? And so there's a new book by one of my friends who just came out called The Immigration Law Death Penalty, which specifically focuses on aggravated felonies, and talking about how those kinds of the programs that have representation, like universal kinds of representation for immigrants, really does help them, because I think that that's part of the challenges in a place like North Carolina, is that legal representation is hard to find, especially legal representation of someone who both understands the immigration consequences, but also understands if someone is charged with a crime, whether or not that is going to impact their ability to stay within this country, right? And so I do think this is sort of a bigger question of what is is there access to representation, to lawyers, to legal counsel that can actually help you understand what the process is going to be. Because I think one of the other piece to that, especially I think given in the New York context, is that we also have laws, right, that change, right? So I think the New York context is always like an interesting one to me to think about. Weed legalization, right, as an example. And it's not retroactive. So plenty of people who have been deported because they might have been charged for weed possession. Today, that would not be the case, right? And so I do think that there's these sort of understanding the bigger context, and also just like being able to talk to the individuals who are impacted to help to better understand what are their preferences, right? Would they prefer to be incarcerated for an extended period of time, or would they want to be deported? And I think that that's a choice that we often do not give people, especially because they often do not have representation to make those kinds of decisions.
Let me ask you a question about Fareed Zakaria's recent opinion piece that he did on this show, where he says United States is being overwhelmed right now by the immigration um, situation. And he has essentially said that maybe there should be a temporary suspension of immigration from an asylum perspective. Because right now in the United States, seemingly from both sides of the aisle can't handle it. New York is having problems, Chicago is having problems. Do you agree with that assessment?
Um, I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I do think a lot of people are coming and applying for asylum, but that's not all immigrants. I think that that's where it gets a little bit sort of murky. So, given the context that like Mexicans are the highest rate of denials for asylum, that it doesn't, it's been, I think, besides this current moment, that I think we think of as asylum as like anyone can get it, right? Or sort of if you can prove, right, certain things that you can get it. And so just knowing, I think the context of like my own family, I'm my family's from Mexico, that many Mexicans are not ever going to be granted asylum. And so while the sort of Mexicans across time have more recently, like the number coming to the United States has decreased, and we've sort of seen more sort of Venezuelans, other groups coming in this current moment. I think people will still come, right? I think the sort of question becomes like, how are you going to support them, and what are you going to do to stop them from coming, right? And so I think the question becomes, how are you encouraging people to stay, right, in their countries? And I think that those are sort of related questions, but I think people will still come regardless if we change like what the asylum sort of seeking process looks like right now. We also know that like not everyone is going to be granted asylum, right? So people can apply, and while they're in that process, they can stay, right? And I think that that's just one part of this bigger migration sort of issue. So I think maybe it would limit some people, but I don't necessarily see it completely stopping the flow of anything, particularly because over time, like, right, we've changed the numbers of individuals that we're granting asylum to. So I don't necessarily see it as like it's going to stop anyone from crossing the border. It might change a little bit, but I don't see it as like a real solution to these like very like international, multi-state, multi-country issues.
Let me ask you this about the HB 10
Mhm.
legislation in North Carolina. And because I want to localize a little bit, then I want to broaden out, as we end the interview. But HB 10 has passed the House of North Carolina, correct?
Yes.
But my understanding that it has not passed the Senate, that there's
Yes.
still holdouts there. So, but even with that, there's also been resistance from certain law enforcement people on the ground in North Carolina, sheriffs who have said, we are not going to comply with this HB 10. And just to inform our listeners, the HB 10, which would regulate or command, rather, mandate that law enforcement would have to tell ICE if they've picked up an undocumented person if they've committed a crime, what is defined as a crime. And many sheriffs, or a lot of sheriffs, have said they are not going to do that. It impedes upon their ability to police the community. It erodes the relationship that they have with the community. Um, how is this ultimately going to play out in North
Yeah.
Carolina? Because what happens there could have implications for how the rest of the nation may react to a law such as that.
Yeah, and I think House Bill 10, it's titled Require Cooperation with ICE 2.0. So I'll give a little of the history too. So 2.0, we've already seen this twice before in different iterations during prior sessions in the state legislature. I think one of the things I also just like want to add on to, I think your description is that I think the assumption, and it's not just the assumption, we've heard politicians also talk about it this way. The way that this is being framed is as if no immigration conversations happen in the first place. And I think that's an incorrect assessment that like we've gone back and forth with politicians about too, because there's prior federal laws. So we sort of refer to this as like the biometric screening component of immigration law enforcement, is that every law enforcement, every jail, every prison throughout the country has fingerprinting capabilities, right? Like that's how we know who that person is. That information automatically gets sent to many agencies, including ICE. And so that's when a person is booked into that facility, right? That is happening everywhere. And so I often have to tell politicians, especially in the North Carolina context, that this is already happening. So saying that what some of the sheriffs have chosen to do is not comply with ICE, I think that's an inaccurate way of saying what's going on, because ICE has that information. They have it from the day someone steps into the jail, steps into the prison. Can they act on that? That's a different sort of component of this conversation. And so what this particular bill is really requiring is that after a person has done their time for their criminal offense, that they can be held a time after that in what's called the ICE detainer. And that particular detainer, some sheriffs, not many, again, I sort of think about it as like this sensationalization again, that only a handful of sheriffs in North Carolina, of the 100, we have 100 sheriffs in North Carolina, only a handful of them have said, we're not willing to hold these people beyond their criminal offense time, the time that they've served for their criminal offense. And so this has caused some issues because on two fronts, right? We know that ICE specifically has come to politicians in North Carolina and said, we want you to present this bill. We want you to be that. And we know that because the politicians are not shying away from saying that. They've been on live television saying that an ICE officer approached me and asked me to introduce this bill. So we do know that it is very much on ICE's radar to try to force sheriffs to do this. I think on the other hand, the reason that sheriffs are also protesting or sort of saying we're not going to do this thing is because plenty of them are saying that like this, they have full authority to do what they want in these counties, right? And so they see this as an infringement on their authority. And this isn't, so I'm always really interested in this particular component because there's so many instances where sheriffs do not want to get support from other federal agencies, right? They're very much more sort of closed-minded around some things, but when it comes to ICE, they're very much willing to sort of support them in this. So I think we'll continue to see versions of this. I think some of the other sort of history about this is that this particular bill is just a copied version of Senate Bill 4, which passed in Texas a few years ago. So it's already this sort of, we sort of see these kinds of bills in other states. I think obviously the most extreme version of this kind of bill is what we see in Florida in this moment, where all of the sheriffs do have to cooperate with ICE. And so I think that we'll continue to see this. I think we right now have enough law enforcement who see that this may erode the trust that you mentioned. And so there are plenty of law enforcement officers besides the sheriffs who are saying they're not going to comply in this particular way with ICE, who have also stepped up and said, we've already had complaints about community members not wanting to talk to us because they're scared that we are ICE officials, right? And so we do know there's some other great work that is done by Daniel Martinez, who's an associate professor at University of Arizona. He specifically looks at when there are these policies. I think he uses the term sanctuary policies in the paper, but when there are these policies that show that law enforcement officers are more willing to work with immigrants, that we do see reports of violent crime increasing. They're more willing to come forward, right, and talk to law enforcement. And so I think plenty of the law enforcement agents that we've talked to, that we sometimes have go speak at the state legislature, they're very aware that this one policy could either mean that they're able to catch criminals in their communities, regardless of their legal status. If they're willing to work with immigrant communities, they're able to have that relationship. And if they do sort of go along with this policy, that they're going to scare community members, right? And so plenty of the sheriffs, I think, have publicly stated, the sheriff and the police chiefs too, have publicly stated that we want to be able to solve local crimes, right? We want to be able to assist community members when they need it most. And so I think that there is this sort of back and forth between the state officials, between the state House representatives and local law enforcement. And I think that as for organizers, that's a wedge that they need to drive, right? They need to be able to sort of say, your local sheriff has said that this is going to create issues with solving crime. And for many of those politicians, crime is something that they're very aware of, that their constituents are very aware of, and is a fear for them. And so it is, I think, something that we'll continue to see. I think I've been part of statewide coalitions to try to defeat these kinds of bills. And so I think this is probably going on 5 or 6 years now. So I do think there's also this strong contingent of folks who are raising awareness about this issue, and really trying to also educate not just the politicians, because like I mentioned, many of them do not understand what is going on when it comes to crimmigration. So part of it is educating them about sort of just the ins and outs of some of that, and also educating community members so that they're more aware of what's happening locally too. So some of the local groups that are part of that statewide coalition, many of them also do budget advocacy. I think that was maybe one of the more surprising things that I looked at for the book. There's a whole chapter that didn't make it because my editor was concerned that people might not be interested in it. But there's a whole chapter that didn't make it that really focuses on what are the financial incentives for these kinds of local enforcement partnerships, and how can community members be more aware of where their money is going. So I think to the case that I looked at, the sort of ignited my interest in this particular component is in the county that I grew up in Henderson County. There was in the county budget a standalone sort of budget item that's called the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Fund. And so I was able to look at that and see over time how much was being reimbursed to the county for holding immigrants. And so I think that that's a piece too where
Financial incentive there.
yes, yeah.
But let me ask you this in the few minutes that we have left. Crimmigration is a subset of immigration issues, difficulties, whatever the case may be. But I was at a conference at the Foreign Policy Association, and the title of the conference was, "Is Latin America the most violent region in the world?" And the presenter said, yes. But one of the things that was talked about was, the United States always has a strategy of the militarization of areas whenever it goes in. I mean, it looks to militarize wherever it's at. And one of the things that's brought up, what would happen if the United States embarked upon a Marshall Plan strategy, as it did for Europe after World War II, and looked at that strategy for many of these nations, which are um, where people are coming from and emigrating to the United States. It's not that people won't come. People will always come to the United States for various reasons. But should we not, at the very least, be looking at the starting point of where people are coming from and look to resolve it from there? So that a Marshall Plan in many of these countries could be like we did in Europe. I mean, what would your response be to that? And we only have a few moments left, so
Yeah, sorry, and I get really long-winded. Yeah, I mean, I think that I would say it's already happened. I sort of come from the perspective that the United States has intervened in many of these countries and supported the destabilization, especially when we've seen popular candidates being elected, especially popular candidates from the left, right? And so I think that we've already contributed to the issue, right? So I do think it's challenging to think
that
about
was
like,
her point. That was a
yeah,
point that we have done those things, but we've never done what we did with Europe, which is simply rebuild it. We've kind of looked to destabilize it, as you've just said.
yeah.
I mean, why not try the other way?
Yeah, I don't know. This question of autonomy, I think, is important for me. And sort of thinking about um what does that process look like while also like apologizing and repairing the harm that's already been done, right? And I think that that's maybe like what's missing from sometimes our foreign approach to many things, right? And so I don't know. I think maybe it's a better process than what we've previously done. But I also think about like the cases that we've been more sort of like recently involved in. And how that maybe hasn't gone great either. So I don't necessarily know if rebuilding without some of these other pieces is possible, particularly because I think I'm a little, what's it called, critical of the ability for us to do it without also like like a military intervention component.
Guest today has been Felicia Arriaga, assistant professor at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Arriaga, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Tony.
And thank you for listening. And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of global importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.